All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new on here, my name is Philip. This is Phil Reacts. Today, hold on to your headphones, because we are stepping into, one of the, boldest, pivots, of rock history. That's right. I mean, we are diving deep into Led Zeppelin III. Yes, the album that made fans scratch their heads in 1970 and then bow down to it decades later. This is the sound of Led Zeppelin saying you think you've got us figured out, think again. So let's unpack the riffs. Let's unpack the acoustic magic, and the mysticism, and yeah, that Viking War cry, that still gives chills 50 years later. Yes. So if you are a classic rock lover, or just someone who respects musical risk taking, you're gonna want to stick around for this one. Yes. But before we get into it, in a little bit of context, so this album was released in October 1970, and after two monster hard rock albums, people expected another full-blown blues rock explosion. Instead, Led Zeppelin took off to a remote house in Wales. Bron-Y-Aur, Bron-Y-Aur, guys. Hopefully, I'm getting that pronunciation right. And and out came this earthy, acoustic and introspective masterpiece. It's got the power, but it's layered, with folk, country, and blues influences, that made it feel like Led Zeppelin had gone off the grid, and found themselves in the process. Yes, that's just a little bit of context. So this album, comes with 10 songs, spans a little over 43 minutes. Put it out there. I've heard a couple of songs on there. I've heard Immigrant Song. I've heard Since I've Been Loving You. I've heard Tangerine. Yes. I think that's the only three songs on the album that I remember that I've listened to. Yes, but today, once again, we are going to listen to the whole album, in its entirety. So we listen to the track, we talk about it, we listen. That's how it's gonna go. So thank you for all the engagement. In my previous Led Zeppelin albums. The first, the second. You guys suggested that I go in that rabbit hole. So today, that's exactly what we're about to do. Led Zeppelin with Led Zeppelin III. We start with the first song, Immigrant Song. Let's get right in, guys. Let's go. Yeah.
Drive our ships to new land.
Okay, yes, the first song, Immigrant Song. Guys, right from the jump, you are hit, with that legendary riff. Jimmy Page, locks in, with this, the raw, chugging guitar line. I have to say, I mean, it's simple, but hypnotic, almost, tribal, in its rhythm. Then we have John Bonham's drums, come, crushing in like thunder, you know, heavy, controlled, but absolutely dominating the mix. John Paul Jones, he goes and he holds things down, on the bass, thick and gritty, giving that foundation so the rest of the band, can just explode over it. This song, is under 3 minutes, but Led Zeppelin, packs more power, into that than most bands, can manage, in 10. Yeah, the energy doesn't dip, for a second, I have to say. I mean, it's like being on a Viking ship, charging towards shore. The rhythm pushes forward, relentlessly, wave after wave. You can feel the adrenaline, in every single note. Then we have yours truly, Robert Plant. That opening scream, guys. You know the one. I mean, it's legendary. I have to say. I mean, the way his voice, sours and slices, through the track. It's almost supernatural. I love the fact that he doesn't sing those lines. He summons them. Based on a few facts that I pulled up, that will became one of the most recognizable moments in rock history. Go figure. Yeah, and once again, based on a few facts that I pulled up in Robert Plant, lyrically, tapped into Norse, mythology. We came from the land, of the ice and snow. It's the Vikings, invading new lands, but there's something symbolic, about it too. It's about power. It's about conquest. It's about exploration, and in a way, that was, Led Zeppelin themselves, at this time. They were conquering the music world, guys. I mean, stepping into new territory, with total confidence. The line, the hammer of the gods, will drive our ships, to new lands, feels almost prophetic. It's the birth, of Led Zeppelin's, mythos, if that makes sense. Yes. I mean, what's crazy is that, I mean, this song, Immigrant Song, was actually inspired, by the band's, trip to Iceland in 1970. Robert Plant, said that visiting the land of ice and snow, gave him that imagery of Vikings, ships and ancient gods. And when you hear the track, it really, feels like the soundtrack, to the, to the landscape. It's cold, it's powerful, and definitely alive. This song, based on a few facts that I pulled up, these are all things that I pulled up. This song also marked the turning point, for Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin III, leaned, into acoustic and, folk sounds, but they still opened the album, with this beast. It's like they were saying, yeah, we can mellow out, but we can also crash you in under 3 minutes. Guys, I have to say, half a century later, this song, still, hits like, it came out yesterday. There's no doubt about it. You hear it in movie trailers, in countless covers. It's definitely timeless. Definitely has that timeless appeal. That scream, that riff, that energy. It's the DNA of hard rock. For me, this is Led Zeppelin, distilled down, to their purest essence, primal, powerful, and larger than life. Every second definitely counts. That's just, what I think about the song. But I really want to hear from you guys also. What's your favorite part of the song? Is it that opening scream, the guitar riff, or just raw power, of the whole track? And drop your thoughts down the comments. Yes. We move on to the second song, Friends. This I've not heard before. Let's take a listen, guys. Ooh, acoustic guitar tone. Yeah. Whoa.
gonna find it, looking for what you knew. So anytime somebody needs you, don't let them down, although it could ease you. Someday you'll need someone like they do, looking for what you knew.
All right, guys. Yes, the second song, "Friends." Wow, this was a journey, I have to say. I mean, the first thing that grabs you about the song "Friends," is that acoustic guitar tone. So Jimmy Page uses an open C6, tuning that immediately gives the song this an earthy resonance quality. It doesn't sound like a typical folk strumming, if you ask me. It feels ancient, almost mystical. That tension-filled minor sounding riff, runs through the song, like a mantra, if you ask me. Then you get this swirling, string arrangements, by John Paul Jones. That I feel like lifts the track into something, cinematic. The strings aren't lush, in a pretty way, but I mean they are sharp, Eastern influence and slightly unsettling, if you ask me. It's almost as if Led Zeppelin, they were experimenting with the idea of psychedelia, meeting folk. Long after that became a thing, became trendy. You can also hear sort of use of the Moog synthesizer, just enough to glue the acoustic, orchestral layers together. What's also genius here, is the restraint. Led Zeppelin, I love the fact that they didn't, overplay on the song. The song definitely breathes, yet it builds tension. Acoustic guitar, strings, and percussive accents, all circle around. This steady pulse. Vocally, Robert Plant really, really went in. His vocal performance, on the song, is haunting. I love the fact that he doesn't, belt like he does, on certain songs like Whole Lot of Love. Instead, he sings, in this plaintive, yearning tone that makes the lyrics, feel deeply personal. You can tell he and Jimmy Page, were coming out of that, Bron-Y-Aur, retreat phase, trying to connect with nature, strip away the excess and get introspective. When he sings "Bright Light," almost building, "Black Night," still here shining. You can definitely feel the duality, the search, for balance, between darkness and light, chaos and then peace. And that chorus, the greatest thing you can ever do now, is trade a smile, with someone, who's blue now. The greatest thing you can ever do now, I mean, that's such a simple but powerful message. One that feels, especially human, coming from a band, so often associated with larger than life in the rock grandeur. Yes. So if you ask me after listening to this song, I mean, this song, isn't a radio single. It's not one of Led Zeppelin's, obvious crowd pleasers, but to me, it's a song that rewards, careful listening. it's the sound, of a band, growing up, exploring new textures, and refusing, to be boxed into, a single genre. For me, this track, is a hidden gem. 9 out of 10 for its originality, for its mood, and emotional honesty. It may not make you head bang, but it will definitely make you feel, and honestly, that's a trademark, of a, true artistry. So that's just me. Let me know what you guys also think, about this song down in the comment section. Do you love, this experimental side, of Led Zeppelin, or do you prefer their heavier, electric sound? Drop your thoughts down in the comment section. Yes, if you're new on here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the family. We move on to the, the third song. Yes, Celebration Day. Let's go.
Face is cracked from smiling, all the fears that she's been hiding, and it seems that pretty soon everybody's gonna know. And her voice is so from shouting, cheering when there's no losing, and she wonders if the days are few and soon they'll have to go.
Okay, guys, so that was the third song, Celebration Day. Guys, right off the bat, the energy on the song Celebration Day just grabs you as a listener. I love the fact that it opens with this smooth transition, from the previous song, Friends, connected by a moves into the title drone. Fun fact, that intro, only exists because the original drum track got erased by accident. Yes, but instead of re-recording they rode with it, and that mistake, actually made the song flow beautifully into place. If you ask me, once the song, kicks in, it's pure Led Zeppelin. Jimmy Page, his guitar, has that sharp, funky tone, that almost, flirts, with, early, hard rock and, proto funk. There is no time wasted here. I love the fact that he drives forward like a, freight train, just like producer, Rick Rubin, once said. John Paul Jones, bass lines, are, busy yet, melodic, filling all the, the spaces, without overpowering. And of course, John Bonham's drumming, man, he plays with so much, swagger and groove, I have to say. Those snare hits, those fills, they hit like thunder, but still groove like jazz. What's so cool about this track, is how tight, it feels. It's not a long jam. I love the fact that it's punchy and urgent. Led Zeppelin, often stretched out, songs live, but here, they packed all their firepower, into 3.5 minutes, of controlled chaos. I loved it, guys. Now, for the vocals, Robert Plant, his vocals here, to me are youthful, sounded raw and full of attitude. He's got that mix of, bluesy confidence, and urban edge. The song, was actually inspired by his, impressions of New York City, which explains the pace and vibe. It feels like, walking through a city, that never sleeps. So lyrically, Celebration Day to me isn't a straightforward, happy anthem, despite its title. Certain lines in there, her face, is cracked, from smiling, all the fears, that she's been hiding. I feel like that line, shows a kind of, a bittersweet, sort of celebration. Joy mixed with tension, triumph, mixed with exhaustion. It's a city song, but it's also about people, their struggles, their hope, their chaos. That's something Led Zeppelin, I feel like they did so well, blending the personal, with the mythic. Robert Plant, delivered every single line, with so much conviction. Like, he's painted the skyline, with his voice. Bright lights, fast life, and that, sense of celebration doesn't always mean peace. I don't know if that makes sense. Yes, that's just what I think about this song. Maybe you guys can also let me know what you think this song is all about down the comment section. But to me, what I love most about this song, is how underrated it is. It's the perfect example of, Led Zeppelin, evolving, moving away from their pure blues roots, into something funkier, something more experimental and something more urban. This is the sound of a band, broadening, horizons in 1970, right as rock was starting to shift into new territory. And the title Celebration Day, has slipped on. It became the name of their 2012, live reunion album and concert film, from the O2 Arena. And that's, fitting, because, this song always, carried that spirit of renewal and energy. So, in my honest take, Celebration Day, might not be the Led Zeppelin song, everyone, talks about, but to me, it's one that, true fans, really, really cherish. It's fast, it's funky, definitely fearless. A snapshot, of a band, at their creative peak, still experimenting, still surprising. So yeah, if you're diving into Led Zeppelin, this album, the third, don't skip this one. It's a short, but wild ride, and that I feel like it captures exactly why Led Zeppelin, could turn even a single rock song into something transcendent. Yes, that's just me and my thoughts, about this song. So yeah, let me know your thoughts, down in the comment section. What do you think about Celebration Day? Does it, deserve more love, in a Led Zeppelin catalog? Drop your thoughts, down the comment section. Yes, we are moving on to the fourth song, Since I've Been Loving You. This song that I've heard before. Let's take a listen, guys. Whoa.
That's right. I've really been the best
Yeah,
of
we are back.
I did what I could, yeah. Of course I love you, baby. How I love you, darling. How I love you, baby. My love you, girl, little girl. Baby, since I've been loving you, yeah. I'm about to lose my war and mind. Ah, yeah. Everybody trying to tell me that it didn't mean me no good. I've been trying. Lord, let me tell I really did the best I could. I've been working from 7 to 11 every night. I said it kind of makes me laugh. But drag. Lord, yeah, let it ride now. Since I've been loving you, I'm about to lose my woman mind. Watch out!
Wow. Yeah.
Said I've been crying, yeah. Oh, my tears, it felt like rain. Don't you hear that? Don't you hear the falling? Don't you hear it? Don't you hear the falling? Do you remember, Mama, when I knocked up on your door?
All right, guys. So yeah, the fourth song, "Since I've Been Loving You." A little backstory based on a few facts that I pulled up. "Since I've Been Loving You," was written by Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones. And it's their take on the classic, slow blues format. Yeah, I mean, what really, really makes it so special, is that it was, recorded, almost live in the studio with very minimal, overdubbing. You can actually hear the squeak, of John Bonham's, bass drum pedal, throughout the track, which has become, this charming little Easter egg, for Led Zeppelin fans. That unfiltered sound, definitely adds, to the authenticity. It's like, you are, standing right, right there, in the room with them, as they pour their souls into, every single note. Now, the vocals, Robert Plant's vocals on this track, are absolutely spine tingling, if you ask me. I mean, he sings, with a desperation and vulnerability that, I mean, to me, feels, completely genuine. You can feel the pain, the exhaustion, and the pleading. This really, really sounds like a man who's been, working himself, to the bone for love, only to have his heart, tested over and over. That opening line, working from 7 to 11, every single night, instantly, sets the mood. It's weary, it's human, and then, it just lets it all out. The way he controls his voice, from soft croons, to those, explosive, high notes, to me, is, nothing short of, extraordinary. That is, Robert Plant, at his, bluesy best, though, so raw, so expressive, and so emotional. Musically, this song is breathtaking. Jimmy Page's guitar, I love the fact that it's warm, but biting. It bleeds emotion with every bend and vibrato. His solo, is often cited, as one of his best. And it's easy, to see why. There's no, flashy shredding, no studio trickery, just pure feeling and masterful, phrasing. John Paul Jones, instead of playing bass, uses the Hammond organ and bass pedals, giving the track, this, deep, soulful undercurrent, that makes everything feel so alive. And then of course, John Bonham, the man plays the drums like, he is channeling his emotions, straight, through the sticks. Controlled power, subtle, ghost notes, and that, ever present, squeaky pedals, that reminds you, this is real music. This is real music, being played by real people. The chemistry between all three is absolutely phenomenal. What's incredible about this song, is how, it captures the emotional weight, of love, of struggle, of, and fatigue, It's not a romanticized, kind of love, it's love that hurts, that drains you, but you can't walk away from it, you can hear the story unfold, just in the lyrics, but in every single chord and every single drum hit. It's one of those songs, where, words, aren't even necessary, after a while. The music itself, tells the story. For me, this song, "Since I've Been Loving You," is one of Led Zeppelin's most soulful moments. It's them proving that, blues, doesn't need, to be fast or loud, to be powerful. It just needs honesty. Every member, gives a career-defining performance, here on the song, and it's one of those, rare tracks, and that gets better, the more you listen. So yeah, whether you are a lifelong, Led Zeppelin fan or discovering them, for the first time, I feel like this song is essential listening. Yeah, a true emotional and musical journey. So yeah, guys, if you felt that to, hit that like button, drop your thoughts down in the comment section. What's your favorite version of this track? The studio version on Led Zeppelin III, or maybe the live cut, from their live performances? Please, let me know down the comment section. We move on to the fifth song, "Out on the Towels." Yes, let's take a listen, guys.
As I walk down the highway, all I do is sing this song. And the train that's passing my way helps the rhythm move along. There is no doubt about the words are clear, the voice is strong, it's all so strong. Just
All right, guys. Yes, the fifth song, out on the tiles. Wow. This was something else, guys. I mean, right from the very first second, I knew, I was in for something wild. John Bonham, kicks this one off, with a monster groove. Those drums, are definitely heavy, precise and just, swaggering. Based on a few facts that I pulled up, the title actually came from John Bonham, himself. It was his phrase, for going out, for a night, on the town. And honestly, you can feel that vibe in the beat. It's like the sound of stepping into a good night out with your buddies. Full of confidence and rhythm. Then you've got Jimmy Page's guitar riff, which is one of his most playful and driving creations. If you ask me personally, I mean it's not overly complicated, but I mean it's incredibly tight. That syncopation between the drums and the guitar definitely makes the whole thing groove like crazy. The riff has that classic Led Zeppelin grit, with Jimmy Page's tone, being thick, slightly overridden, but still clean enough to cut through. And then John Paul Jones, I mean, as always, he's on the bass, good lord. I mean, his playing here locks in perfectly with, John Bonham's, kick drum. I mean, you can't overstate how crucial that rhythm section is to Led Zeppelin's magic. They give the track this solid unstoppable engine whilst Jimmy Page dances over it. By the time the riff starts looping in the outro, it feels hypnotic, almost trance like the way it fades out with John Bonham still pounding those toms. Guys, I loved it. For the vocals and then the lyrics, Robert Plant, came in, with that sour and confident, vocal delivery. And I love how raw and unfiltered, his tone, sounds here. There's a real live in the studio vibe. Like they just, hit record and went for it. His phrasing is definitely playful, the kind of loose swagger that makes early Led Zeppelin, feel dangerous, and fun, all at the same time. Lyrically, I mean, it's simple, even casual. It's about, enjoying life, being out on the road, soaking up the sun, having a good woman and just, living free. To me, it's not meant to be deep poetry. It's a vibe song, a celebration of energy, and motion. The hook, all I need from you. It's all all I need from you is all your love. I feel like that line is profound, but I mean, it was delivered, with so much, conviction that, I mean, it almost feels huge. And at the fade out, Robert Plant, just lets loose, with little ad libs and shouts. That kind of spontaneous energy is exactly what, to me, makes the Led Zeppelin, sound alive. Yes. So yeah, based on a few facts that I pulled up, what's really, really interesting is that Led Zeppelin, they rarely, played this song, out on the tiles live, but parts of it, especially that killer intro riff, actually, made their way into the performances, of Black Dog and John Bonham's, drum solos in 1977. That's how strong the groove was. It had enough power to become part, of their live DNA. In the context of Led Zeppelin III, I mean, this song, is the perfect closer, for side one, if you ask me. I mean, definitely bridges the heavier, riff-driven sound, of the early Led Zeppelin albums, with the more acoustic, folk influence in the side two. It's the band, showing that they can still rock hard, whilst experimenting with rhythm and form, So yeah, if you are new to Led Zeppelin and you only know the hits, give this one a spin, with good headphones. Focus on John Bonham's drumming. That's the real star here. You definitely hear how every hit feels like it's pushing the song forward like a locomotive that never loses steam. For me, out on the tiles, it's Led Zeppelin. At their most joyful and unpretentious. I mean, it's pure groove. Pure fun. And pure chemistry. I'd give this like a hard 9 out of 10. Not because it's their most iconic track, but because it captures the raw spirit of what made this band so untouchable. Yeah, so that's just me and my take. Let me know what you guys also think about this song down in the comment section. Do you consider this song one of Led Zeppelin's underrated bangers? Please drop your thoughts down in the comment section. We move on to the said song, Gallows Pole. Let's take a listen, guys.
I see my friends coming, riding many a mile.
Okay.
Friends, you get some silver, you get a little gold. What did you bring me, my dear friends? Keep me from the gallows pole. What did you bring me? Keep me from the gallows pole. I couldn't get no silver, I couldn't get no gold. You know that we're too damn poor. Keep from the gallows pole. Hangman, hangman, hold it a little while. I think I see my brother coming, riding many a mile. Brother, you give me some silver as you get a little gold. What did you bring me, my brother? Keep me from the gallows pole. Brother, I hold you to some silver. I got a little gold. I put a little of everything. Keep me from the gallows pole. Yes, I've told you to keep me from the gallows pole. Hangman, hangman, turn your head a while. I think I see my sister coming, riding many a mile, my. Sister, I implore you, take him by the hand, take him to some shady power, save me from the wrath of this man. Please take him, save me from the wrath of this man. Hangman, hangman, upon your face a smile. Tell me that I'm free to ride for many a mile. Oh yes, she got a fine sister. She want my blood to gold. She want my blood to boil it hot. Keep me from the gallows. Yeah. Early from this silver. Your sister want my soul. But now her life goes so hard. See her swinging on the gallows. Yeah. But now her life goes so hard. See her swinging on the gallows. Swinging on the gallows pole. Swinging on the gallows pole. Swinging on the gallows pole. Swinging on the gallows
Okay, guys. Yes. So that was the said song, Gallows Pole. After listening to it, I have to say, I mean, right from the very few seconds, I could feel that, this wasn't, your typical, hard rock, Led Zeppelin track. I love the way, it opens with that hauntingly rhythmic and acoustic strumming. you know, and immediately there is this feeling of foreboding, almost like we are being invited into a centuries old tale being retold around a campfire. Based on a few facts that I pulled up, the song is actually based on a traditional folk ballad called "The Maid Freed from the Gallows," a story that dates back hundreds of years. Yeah. In it, a condemned person pleads with loved ones to save them from hanging, and depending on the version, sometimes they are betrayed, sometimes they are saved. Led Zeppelin, of course, twist it into something darker and something more cynical. Yes, Robert Plant's vocals on here, was truly, truly something special. If you ask me, I mean, I love the way he doesn't go for his usual, powerful wails. Instead, he narrates the story almost conversationally at first, drawing you as the listener into the desperation, of the character. But as the song builds, so does his intensity. You can hear the panic and frustration start to seep in, with every verse. And by the time he hits those final lines, there is this manic edge, in his voice, that perfectly mirrors the cruel twist in the story's ending. It's one of those vocal performances that to me shows how versatile Robert Plant really, really was. He could be both a storyteller and an emotional detonator. I don't know if that makes sense. Yes. Now, musically, I mean, the instrumentation of the song. I mean, this is a brilliant, arrangement. Jimmy Page, definitely deserves a huge, credit here. Not only does he handle the acoustic and electric guitars, but he also, plays the banjo in there. Something he reportedly, hadn't played before recording this track. Based on a few facts that I pulled up, that banjo, gave the song this eerie, rustic, texture. Perfectly bridging the gap between, English folk and American blues traditions. John Paul Jones definitely adds that mandolin and bass, layering those sounds to create that steady momentum that makes a song, to me feel like it's literally galloping towards the gallows. Yes. Also, what is really really striking is the way the song builds tension. It starts out it's past just voice and guitar, but with each verse, new elements creep in. The banjo, the bass, the drums. By the time we hit the climax, it's a full-blown frenzy of strings, percussion, and desperation. This is storytelling through arrangement, if you ask me. I mean, the music definitely mirrors the rising, panic of the condemned person, trying to buy their life back. And then there's that ending, chilling. The hangman, laughs. The deal fails. The music, once frantic, suddenly, cuts, leaving this eerie silence, that I feel like almost, feels like the drop, of the gallows door itself. Led Zeppelin didn't just cover an old folk song here, if you ask me. They reimagined it with the grim, cinematic flair that still, feels fresh over 50 years later, in my opinion. Guys, I loved it. I definitely loved it. What I loved about this, song Gallows Pole, is that it's not about flashy solos or heavy riffs. It's about atmosphere. It's about pacing and it's about emotional storytelling. I love the way it captures the folk rock spirit that defined the heart of Led Zeppelin III. This album is something else. So Gallows Pole is definitely haunting. It's definitely dynamic and deeply human. This is a masterclass in how to take an ancient song and make it thunder with modern emotions. I loved it, guys. That's just my take. If I were to be rating this, I'd definitely give this song a 9 out of 10. Not because it's their heaviest or most complex track, but because it's one of their most cleverly constructed and emotionally charged performances. Yeah. But that's just my take. That's just my perspective. Let me know what you guys also think about this one down in the comment section, guys. We are moving on to the 7th song, Tangerine. This one I have heard before. Let's take a listen, guys. Okay. Yeah.
summer's day. I only find it slips away to gray. The hours they bring me pain. Tangerine, tangerine, living reflections from a dream. I was her love, she was my queen, and now 1,000 years between. Thinking how it used to be. Does she still remember times like these? To think of us again. And I do.
All right, guys. So that was the seventh song, "Tangerine." One that I've already listened to. Happens to be one of my favorite songs, from Led Zeppelin. Yes. So from the very first few seconds of the song, I mean, I could tell, this song, comes from the heart. There's that little, false start, that quick, imperfect, strum before the real intro, and I feel like, it instantly makes the song, feel more human. Jimmy Page, layers, both, 6-string and 12-string and acoustic guitars here, giving it a shimmering, texture that just glows, and then out of nowhere, you hear that pedal steel guitar, sliding in, something you wouldn't expect from Led Zeppelin, in my opinion, giving it a dreamy, almost country folk, sort of flavor. John Paul Jones, kept it grounded, with a warm, subtle bass line, whilst John Bonham, known for his thunderous drumming, plays with, incredible restraint. Soft, spatial hits, that lets the acoustic instruments, breathe. Then there's that, short, electric solo by Jimmy Page, smooth, lyrical, and not flashy, but it definitely cuts right in the emotion of the song. Every single note definitely felt emotional, in my opinion. Yes. So the vocals, Robert Plant's vocal delivery here is just delightful. He's not belting or souring. He's reminiscent. You can almost hear him looking back on the love that's long gone. His voice tinged with both warmth and regret. Certain lines in there, measuring, a summer's boy, I only find it slips away to gray. I feel like that single line, captures the bittersweet in the passage of time so perfectly. The chorus, tangerine, tangerine, living in reflection from a dream. I feel like that line, the chorus, feels like a mantra, something distant and ghostly, like he is singing, to a memory. And the harmonies, he layers, with himself, give it this, haunting, dreamlike, quality. Based on a few facts that I pulled up, the lyrics were written by Jimmy Page, not Robert Plant, which is rare, for Led Zeppelin. And I feel like that gives the song a slightly different flavor, more introspective, more poetic, and maybe even more personal, from Jimmy Page's perspective. Lyrically, Tangerine, is about lost love, but not in a bittersweet type of way. It's about cherishing something that once was, even though it's gone. The word tangerine itself, symbolizes warmth, tenderness, or a flash of color, from the past. There is this underlying message, about how time changes everything. How even the most vivid memories start to fade. It's definitely nostalgic, without being sentimental, and that balance, is definitely what makes it feel so genuine. You can almost imagine this being written on a quiet, evening, maybe after a long hour, reflecting on a love that couldn't, survive the chaos of the road. Yes, Tangerine, to me personally, might not be Led Zeppelin's song that blows your speakers, but I mean, it's one that reaches straight to your heart. I love the fact that it's delicate, it's honest, and it definitely reveals a side of the band that's too often overshadowed by their heavier work. To me, it perfectly represents Led Zeppelin III era, when the band traded amplifiers for acoustics and found beauty in simplicity. So yeah, Tangerine isn't just a song about lost. It's a reflection on time, it's a reflection on memory, and how music can hold on to feelings long after life has moved on. Guys, that's just my thing. Let me know what you think about this song down in the comment section. Do you enjoy it? Does it hit the soft spots in you? Please share your thoughts down in the comment section. Yes, we move on to the 8th song, That's the Way. Let's take a listen, guys. Whoa. Yeah.
I don't know how I'm gonna tell you. I can't play with you no more. I don't know how I'm gonna do what Mama told me. My friend, the boy next door. I can't believe what people saying. You gonna let your hair hang down. I'm satisfied to sit here working all day long. You're in the darker side of town. When I'm out, I see you walking. Why don't your eyes see me? Could it be you found another game to play? What did Mama say to me? That's the way. Oh, that's the way it ought to be. Yeah, yeah. Mama said that's the way it ought to stay. Yeah, yeah. Ooh. And yesterday I saw you standing by the river, and were those tears that filled your eyes? And all the fish that lay in dirty water dying, had they got you hypnotized? And yesterday I saw you kissing tiny flowers, but all that lives is born And so I say to you that nothing really matters, and all you do is stand and cry. I don't know what to say about it when all your ears have turned away. But now's the time to look and look again at what you see. Is that the way it ought to stay? That's the way it ought to be. Oh, don't you know now? Mama said that's the way it's gonna stay. Yeah.
Okay, guys, so that was the eighth song, off of this album. That's the way. I have to say, guys, right from the very first, strum, I was able to feel, this song's warmth. Jimmy Page's, 12-string acoustic guitar immediately, pulled me into, this, mellow, folk-inspired soundscape. You can almost, see the countryside, in your mind, when you listen to the song, which definitely makes sense. Because this was a few facts that I pulled up. This was written at, Bron-Y-Aur. Guys, please let me know if I'm pronouncing it right. That small cottage in Wales, where Jimmy Page and Robert Plant escaped, to find inspiration. There is no bombastic drumming, with the song. Just John Bonham, kept it minimal, with some, tambourine work, and John Paul Jones, sprinkled in a touch of, mandolin. That to me adds, this delicate shimmer, that mix, is so organic, and to me it feels like the band, is sitting right in your living room, and that is one of the reasons why this album Led Zeppelin III, it's such a beautiful album. They definitely showed the world, they weren't just about heavy blues rock. They could craft something deeply emotional and intimate too. Now we definitely have to talk about Robert Plant's vocals, because this might be one of the most vulnerable performances ever, in my opinion. He's not, belting or souring here. It feels more like he is confessing. His tone is soft and almost fragile. And there's this real ache in his delivery. The way he sings certain lines in there, I don't know, how I'm gonna, tell you, I can't play with you no more. I feel like that line, feels like, someone, breaking the news of a painful truth. Not out of anger, but out of sadness and inevitability. And I feel like that's really the power, of the song. It's not trying to impress you; it's trying to, reach you, if that makes sense. I love the fact that it's introspective. I love the fact that it's melancholic, and it's also incredibly human. You can feel Robert Plant's, honestly bleeding through every single word. Lyrically, based off of the lyrics, this song, can be interpreted in a few ways. On the surface, it's about, two young people, whose friendship or relationship, is being torn apart, possibly by social, disapproval. You look at certain lines in there, your hair's hanging down, you are in the dark side of town. Based on a few facts that I pulled up, have often been seen as a comment, on prejudice and division, But beyond that, it's really, really a good song about change, about realizing that, the world, isn't always, kind, or fair. And that sometimes the people you care about, drift away because that's just, the way, things go. There is this in the bittersweet and acceptance in the title itself. That's the way, life moves on, even when, your heart doesn't want to. Yeah. Guys, I loved it. I definitely loved this one. So let me know down in the comment section if you felt something listening to this song. Drop your comment in it down below, and tell me, what the song, really means to you. Don't forget to, subscribe. Don't forget to hit that like button. We move on to the 9th song, Bron-Y-Aur Stomp. Bron-Y-Aur Stomp, guys. I'm sorry. Forgive me if I'm not mentioning it right. Yes, but let's take a listen. Wow, Jimmy. Good. Guys, so that's the title of the song, Bron-Y-Aur Stomp. Guys, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't mention the title of the song. Maybe you guys can, help me down in the comment section. But yeah, we definitely have to start with the music itself. Jimmy Page, absolutely shines on this one, but in a totally understated kind of way. I love the way he traded the electric Les Paul, for a bright, jangly, acoustic. That's got this, folk blues, swing to it. The picking pattern, is absolutely crisp. It's rhythmic and kind of hypnotic. You can almost feel his fingers dancing across the strings. Then if you got John Paul Jones on in the double bass instead of his usual electric, that's such a smart move if you ask me. It definitely gives the whole thing this warm, organic, low end that to me fits in perfectly with the rustic vibe. And listen closely, John Bonham is not smashing drums, this time. He's working magic, with castanets, with spoons and hand percussion. I love the fact that it's playful but still incredibly tight. Only John Bonham, could make a jug band, groove sound that's refined. I have to say, what I really appreciate, here is how Led Zeppelin, made this song, breathe. Nothing, felt forced. It's like, they were jamming, on a porch somewhere, surrounded by trees, completely at peace. And I feel like that's the magic, simplicity meeting mastery. For the vocals of this song, I feel like Robert Plant's really, his vocals was just, pure joy. You can tell, he's smiling, as he sings. Instead of, the high octane wails, we are all, used to. I love the way, he leans into a more rootsy, conversational sort of tone, like he is telling you about a happy memory. Based on a few facts that I pulled up, this song is about his dog, Strider. Yeah, named after, Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings. It's this, heartwarming little ode, to companionship and the beauty of, simple living. Ain't but one thing to do, spend my natural life with you. That's such a wholesome line, if you ask me. It's rare, to hear your Plant, this relaxed and carefree. Lyrically, it's about, escaping fame and reconnecting, with what really matters. Nature, peace, friendship, and a little bit of love. You can really feel the influence of that, Welsh, countryside cottage, Bron-Y-Aur, Bron-Y-Aur, where the band, retreated, to find some, quiet inspiration. So what makes this song, so great to me is how it expands, what Led Zeppelin was capable of. It's proof, they weren't just a hard rock and powerhouse. They were musicians, in the truest, sense. This song feels alive. It's got, swing. It's got soul and a genuine happiness that you don't, find in rock, from that era. So yeah, this one definitely gets the major respects from me. It's not about showing off. It's about feeling free, and that's the kind of rock and roll we all need every once in a while. Guys, let me know if you enjoyed this song down in the comment section. Let me know your thoughts about it. Yes. So we move on to the last song, off of this album. Hats off to Roy Harper. Yeah, let's take a listen, guys.
When I done quit all the baby, I believe.
That is slide guitar.
Won't be late. You know that I mean, second later, when I done quit all the baby, I believe I should have gone. Well, I ain't no monkey. I can't climb no tree.
All right, guys. So that was hats off to Roy Harper, the final song, off of this album, Led Zeppelin the third. After listening to this song, I have to say the first thing that hits you is that slide guitar. It's raw, it's buzzing and drenched in distortion. Jimmy Page, isn't playing clean. He is playing haunted. I don't know if that makes sense. Yes, I mean it's got that bottleneck blues, type of sound, but he filters it, through his own psychedelic sensibilities. The guitar definitely feels alive, almost, unstable, like it's being played, through an old radio in the middle of a thunderstorm. Meanwhile, Robert Plant's vocals, are intentionally distant, and run through some sort of, I don't know if it's a heavy reverb and filtering. It sounds like he's singing through a vintage mic, on the front porch, somewhere, in the deep south. But with that, signature Robert Plant and how peeking through. There is no bass, or drums, to ground this track. It's just the interplay, of that ghostly guitar and Robert Plant's, wailing voice, which to me gives it this non-polished, almost primitive sort of power. So based on a few facts that I pulled up, this track was recorded mostly live in the studio, and I feel like you can hear Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, feeding off, each other, improvising, almost like a jam session that, accidentally made it onto the record, and that spontaneity to me, gives it, a unique charm. Yeah, lyrically, hats off to Roy Harper. Isn't telling a single clear story. To me, it's a collage, a patchwork of old blues, lines, borrowed and reimagined, from artists, like Booker White and Oscar Woods. Based on a few facts that I pulled up. I mean, Robert Plant, took those traditional blues phrases, and injected his own wild energy into them. To me, it's not about lyrical structure here. It's about feel. Channeling the soul and the pain of classic bluesmen. But with Led Zeppelin, sort of twist. And of course, the title itself, is a tribute to Roy Harper. And based on a few facts, that I pulled up, Roy Harper, is a British, soul singer, who was a close friend, of the band. And Roy Harper, was known for his, unconventional approach to songwriting, much like this track, which feels like a nod, to artistic freedom and not following the rules. So the song works, both as a musical experiment, and as a genuine, hat tip to someone, who embodied the same spirit of originality. I mean, within the context of Led Zeppelin III, I mean, hats off, Roy Harper, serves as a perfect, closer. The whole album experiments with acoustic, textures, folk and blues, and this track, definitely brings it, full circle, by going all the way, back to the roots. After the sweeping beauty of, That's the Way and Tangerine, this tough, stripped down piece reminds you where, Led Zeppelin's heart really, really lies, in the blues. That's also obvious. It's like, they are saying, yes, we can write hits and anthems, but this is where, it all started. It's a bit, chaotic, but intentionally so. Like an old bluesman, telling stories in the dark, half sung, half moaned, full of, emotion and mystery. Yeah, I have to say that is just right off the bat. This song, hats off, to Roy Harper, isn't for everyone, and I feel like that's okay. It's not radio friendly or melodic, in the traditional sense, but if you approach it with, open eyes, you'll definitely find something raw, something soulful, and something fearless. This track definitely captures Led Zeppelin, at their most experimental, if you ask me personally. A band not afraid to pay tribute, to their heroes, whilst tearing down musical boundaries. Definitely a strange farewell, to, to Led Zeppelin III, this album, but also a fitting one. A final blow that tips the hat to both the roots of blues, and to a friend, who inspired them to stay authentic. Guys, let me know what you think about this one. Is this song, hats off to Roy Harper, an underrated gem, or just, too far out there? Drop your thoughts down the comment section. Yes, guys. So, may I ask, what's the legacy of Led Zeppelin III? At first, I feel like our critics didn't get it. Fans, I'm pretty sure they were confused at some point. I was confused, but looking back now, this is the album that I feel like expanded, Led Zeppelin's universe. It proved that they weren't, just a loud, rock band. They were artists. I love the fact that this album is earthy, it's mystical and fearless. And honestly, it feels like the deep breath in between the storms of Led Zeppelin, the first, and Led Zeppelin the second. From the raw power of Immigrant Song to the tenderness of, That's the Way. This album, is balanced. It's light and shade, thunder and calm, and it still holds up beautifully after 50 years, I have to say. So I don't have much to say about it. That's just, my own perspective about, this entire album. But that's just me. I want to know from you guys also, what's your favorite track, of this album? Are you more into the hard hitting, openness like, Immigrant Song, or the acoustic and the beauty of That's the Way? Drop your thoughts, in the comments. I love, hearing your takes. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget, to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. And hey, if you want me to react to Led Zeppelin the fourth next, please let me know down in the comment section. I'll definitely sit here and do just that. Until next time, keep the music loud and keep your hearts open. Peace out.